You've probably heard about Oscar Grant and his murder on a BART train station platform. Well, we'll discuss the impact that his death has had on Talking with Henrietta, coming up next. Hi, I'm Henrietta. Welcome to the show. As many of you might remember, Oscar Grant was a 22-year-old man when he was fatally shot by a BART policeman on New Year's Day in 2009. In the 10 years since his murder, he has become a larger-than-life symbol. In 2013, he became the subject of an award-winning film called Fruitvale Station. But perhaps more importantly, the capture of his death on multiple cameras has been called the most seismic moment for police accountability since the 1991 beating of Rodney King. On this show, I will talk to two guests who were close to Oscar Grant: his uncle Cephas Johnson, also known as Uncle Bobby X, Johnson's wife, Beatrice X Johnson, and Minister Keith Mohammed, who has been very much involved with Grant's family and the aftermath of his murder. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's a real pleasure to have you here with me.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Now, discuss some of the impact. I talk about how it has had tremendous impact. Why?
I want to clear up something. I actually didn't know Oscar. I learned of Oscar through the movement and through the family. I got involved in the Oscar Grant movement and became a member of the family. But I learned of Oscar from his mother, Wanda, as we drove up and down the highway to Los Angeles, from Oakland to Los Angeles for the trial, because I was in the trial every day when they moved it to Los Angeles. So I didn't get the privilege to know Oscar in life. I learned of him and learned to love him and fight for justice for him and all impacted by police terrorism.
Well, you are setting
life.
a high mark for honesty already, right? Yes. So the viewers know we're starting right off with honesty.
That's
right?
That's right. That's right.
And the impact of for right now, what impact do you think his murder had, and how did it become such a worldwide case?
We were blessed in the realities that existed in Oakland in the year 2009. At the time that we learned of Oscar's murder, which for most was beginning January the 3rd, of course, the family knew because they experienced that pain themselves. But there were activists that were meeting at the Olivet Institutional Missionary Baptist Church, headed by the late, great Reverend Gordon Humphreys, whose church became the weekly meeting space for the town hall meetings that emerged around the time that Oscar was assassinated. We were there on January the 3rd. News of Oscar's killing was just reaching the news. At that point, video had not yet been seen. All we knew was that a young man had been killed at BART.
No, I have a question for you. He was not the first young man to be killed in Oakland, and maybe not even at BART. So what was it about his murder?
I think that a combination of the public viewing of evidence, the fact that activists were already meeting on issues that included police brutality and murder, but also included the mass incarceration rates of our young men, most notably in the state of California, with the largest penal system in the world. When the governor the other day said that they were going to not execute anyone at death row, and they showed the pictures of all of the inmates at death row in San Quentin, and that's the most integrated picture I've seen in Northern California, meaning that half the images there were black. So on January the 3rd, black and Latino men met at Olivet Institutional Baptist Church to go through issues that were important for us already. And it was that very day that the news that Oscar had been slain hit the public. Leaving from that meeting, the video footage hit the national news or the local news. And I actually received a call on my way home from the meeting asking, had I seen the news? My brother in San Francisco, Brother Christopher Muhammad, called me when he saw it and said, have you seen this? Now I'm getting multiple phone calls. At some point, he began organizing by calling Minister Farrakhan to get his thoughts on our pursuit of justice in this case. The minister instructed him, go do what you think is best, and we began.
Okay, now before you start talking about what you began doing, let me turn to you. And would you prefer to be called Uncle Bobby or Cephas or Cephas?
Cephas. Uncle Bobby's fine.
Okay, Uncle Bobby.
Yes.
When did you hear the news and when did you become actively involved?
Well, of course, it was New Year's Eve. Actually, it had just turned into New Year's Day. You know, and I need to give this backdrop before I talk about when I heard the news. So at about, you know, a little after 12:30, Oscar really was on my spirit. And I couldn't understand why. He's a young man. He's out enjoying New Year's Eve, having fun. And at about 12:40, I went on and texting. And I said, Uncle loves you, God loves you, and God loves your family. And an hour and a half later, he was murdered. You know, so I like to always share that because it's important that we recognize when someone is speaking to our spirit, that we reach out to that person.
Well, it's a good thing you did.
Yes.
When you felt the impulse to do so.
Right, because what ended up happening, after I saw that video, I actually collapsed. When I collapsed and came back, I was in extreme rage, anger, the type of anger that was really set for destruction. Nothing constructive, but destruction. That's how mad I was. And I can cite an example. When we look at Savante Clark, Stephan Clark's brother, and how he took his anger, you know what I'm saying? And then he was criminalized and dehumanized behind his anger from some of his actions.
I know, we saw him in the city council chamber kind of on the table.
Well, that's how you feel. And so, but what happened when I actually came back, a common spirit hit me, and I remembered how blessed I was to text Oscar those words.
But it makes me even wonder, did you really believe it had happened?
What?
Or maybe it was a nightmare? Or...
Right. So, of course, that night when I got the phone call, it was from my sister that Oscar had been shot. And sadly, the first thing I thought was, what did he do wrong? Not knowing that it was really the police involved. And so when I actually began to get the information, I couldn't believe that an officer, the way I'm being told, would shoot my nephew in the back. And so that was the reality that we had to begin to deal with until we saw the video. The video is what really inflicted the pain and made everything else blurry. And it was from there when I realized how blessed I was to text him, and I realized then that text was for me. Because had I not texted Oscar, I believe today no one would know me as Uncle Bobby, or affectionately known as Uncle Bobby, doing more constructive work versus destructive work. And so I am so thankful. And I have to give that backdrop because the essence of what happened to Oscar was extremely painful for the family. I mean, he was a father. You know, he was my nephew. He was a son. He was a grandson. He was a brother.
And he was also turning his life around in terms of accepting responsibility and deciding that he wanted to do good and something worthwhile in life.
We had that conversation, you know, for him to say, I think I'm going to move to Concord, because he wanted his daughter to be in what he considered at that time a safe space. And he was talking about getting his barber license. So to actually hear your nephew sharing his new self, his new becoming responsible self, though he was already a responsible father, because Tatiana loved her daddy. She still loves him today. And you know, and my point is that because he was changing his life, and me hearing this, there were great things that I was looking forward to in seeing Oscar as he developed and, you know, and matured as a man. You know, because I used to take him with me to work, and he would always look out for his friend. John Toot, can he work with us today? Because he needs to make some money. Well, you know, I'm going to have to split that with you, Oscar. Oh, no problem. He'd have no problem in sharing his money that I was paying him with his friends that he wanted to bring along to make some money. That's the type of person he was.
Now, he did have two friends, very close friends, and they were also later killed. Were these the same two close friends? The one that went with you?
John Two is one of them. Innocente, not Innocente, Chris Ratherfee, he wasn't one of them that went with me as we did work. You know, it was Nigel, not Jackie Bryson, but, you know, some of his other friends. But Innocente and all them played baseball together, you know, and they would come by my mama's house, which is Oscar's grandmother's house, and just, you know, just have fun as young men.
Sure. Yeah. Now, do you pronounce your name Beatrice?
Beatrice.
Beatrice, yes. I knew there was something different.
Yes.
You pointed out from the very beginning that you're not a member of the family in knowing him at that time, a blood relative. How did you get involved?
I got involved because I was already an activist, one, and then I was protocol director, student protocol director for Oakland under the leadership of Minister Keith Muhammad. And so I actually, someone called me and I went to the funeral. I was at the funeral. I was at the district attorney's office, and then I was with the happenings that happened that evening. And so I got involved just from the work and from the Nation of Islam being so involved, and I was student director of protocol at that time. So that work and, you know, just a combination of work got me involved. Now, I could go back to 1985 when I had my first case in police. It was my friend, Stephan in San Diego, who the police beat up, but they didn't know they was harassing him. I won't tell okay, they stopped the truck and said, we got Crips and Bloods in the truck. Crips and Bloods don't ride together in the truck. So that was already wrong, right? And it was a nice young man. He was from a good family. They were all good young men. So the police got his stuff. Everything was fine. He started beating him up, but he had a black belt. So he took the gun, and he out of fear, and he shot the police officer, ran over another police officer, shot the woman. It was a woman in the car that they were showing out for, a ride-along, because he was in fear. And so at that time, I was 21. But it was the youth, it was us who galvanized the community, and we protested, and we was at court, and he got off that case.
Oh, that's amazing. So you've been an activist for some time now.
They don't talk about it because he never spent a day in jail for that murder.
Well, that's...
And the lawyer proved out of fear, and it's such a big case that I don't know why people don't talk about it now, because you could get a lot of defense for these people who are going into court. You know, when they say they run from the police.
Who talks about it are the police when they would say they
feared
for their life.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so that's the justification for them.
And we have that example, and we should use it more because it is evidence to our fight in this fight for justice, for police accountability. So that was my first case in 1985.
Sure.
And then at that time, I had a 14-year-old son. You know, and my thing was, I want my son to live past 22. And as a black mother in America, even today, I haven't lost a son, but who knows what day any of us can get that call. Any family, any
you're
family.
Absolutely right.
You know what I'm saying? So we're not even free to just live because being a black parent in America, either the police got called because the police killed them or someone killed them in our community. And that's not living.
Yes, no.
Right.
I'd like to turn to Minister Muhammad because and follow up with the call that was made to Minister Farrakhan.
Yes, ma'am.
And he said, do what you think is best.
Do what we think is best, and he directed us. So we immediately began to call in black elected officials, black clergy leaders, black activists to meet us at Olivet for an emergency meeting. This was one day before Oscar's funeral. We had not met the family. Thanks to the help of Councilwoman Deescalation Brooks, County Supervisor Keith Carson, of course, Reverend Humphreys, and many others. That day, we made a phone call to the district attorney to ask his intention regarding Johannes Messerly and the shooting of Oscar Grant, and he was hesitant to talk.
No, Johannes Messerly was the BART police officer who shot
Exactly.
him, saying that he had mistakenly pulled out his gun when he meant to pull out his taser.
That was what he said after they saw the videotape. The very first thing he said was, I thought he had a gun. And he testified in court, I couldn't get his hands, and hands are weapons, which tells us instantly, as an officer of the law, if you think that a suspect has a weapon, you don't go for a taser, you go for a gun.
But at the same time, after he shot him, supposedly he fell to his knees, grabbed his head, and said, oh my God, I shot him.
I didn't do that.
Well, police officers do that often, regardless of the cause of the shooting, because people don't shoot people every day. So any police officer that shoots anybody has to go to the psychologist, take a few weeks off, stay off the street. That's
Because
common
it's traumatic
protocol.
for
because
them,
it's
too.
traumatic for a police officer, it's traumatic for a Marine, it's traumatic for a member of the Army. They have to train them to shoot somebody and keep fighting. Most people would shoot somebody, and out of humanity, there'd be a pause in their activity.
Yes, so you have to be trained to be a murderer.
Exactly.
Yes.
So
Fighting
I
for
wouldn't
your
say
country.
whatever the cause is,
Yes.
there's a training that goes along with
Yes.
it, and there's a follow-up that goes along with it. Now, we were blessed that we had Council Member Brooks, who called then District Attorney Tom Orloff, who refused to meet with our group of leaders. He said, I'm not talking to you at all initially. Then he said, I'll talk to the 3 of you, but there were 20 of us in the room. And Councilmember Brooks, in her very beautiful way, said in essence to him, all or nothing at all. Well, he said nothing at all, and we determined in that moment that we'll be at his office tomorrow. We're going to have a press conference in front of the Alameda County District Attorney's office, and then when that press conference is done, we're going up to his office to demand a meeting. The funeral was happening that very day, and in the moments that we were meeting with the DA, we were able to meet him. There were some Bay Area journalists who were on record in that meeting, but really notably in that meeting were staff members of Mayor Dellums, were staff members of all of the political offices that had in place black elected officials. So I'm sure that Congresswoman Barbara Lee had an ear in the room. I'm sure that Assembly Member Sandra Swanson had an ear in the room.
So what brought them all together? The telephone calls?
Well, the calls, and what's the point of having a black elected official if those in government would use, as Dellums called it, state paid for bullets and take the life unjustifiably of a young man? What's the point of having black elected officials in place if they don't do for us at that time in 2009 what we couldn't get in 1909? In 1909, we weren't in any offices. So when we were being lynched for being falsely accused of looking at white women or being smart-mouthed with white people or not wanting to get off a train or a bus and being beaten or killed, there were no black elected officials. Now there are. So what's the point?
And
what's
so
the
you're
point?
saying that they
Barack
should
Obama
be...
was just elected. He hadn't been inaugurated yet. But we had in Oakland at that time, uniquely, we had the Congressional Black Caucus chairperson in Barbara Lee. We had the California State Black Caucus chairperson in Sandra Swanson. We had in Alameda County our brother Supervisor Keith Carson as the head of the black elected officials and faith-based leaders. So if you've got all this black political power in one place, then that power needed to be focused on a case that black people knew needed attention.
Should have been made accountable. So,
and they did their part.
Okay, now, at the same time, there were major disturbances throughout the city. What do you think this was just a natural ground swelling of anger?
Absolutely.
That erupted?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
It was justifiable anger. Now, by God's grace, we went out to organize. We were participants in some of the community rallies. We didn't lead those rallies. We spoke in some of them. We offered counsel and guidance, but the beauty was that many of those activists, when we began organizing, those right off the street, came to the weekly town hall meetings for organizing and instruction. It didn't mean that they weren't angry. It didn't mean that they didn't have plans of things they thought would be best, but they respected this unified effort of black Muslims, black Christians, black politicians, black activists, black atheists, black Greek letter organizations, black street organizations, gathered together weekly for the purpose of organizing. Now, when that occurred, historically, organizing in black communities has been treated by the federal government and law enforcement as an unlawful activity. It was those kind of activities that drew the FBI to Marcus Garvey's case, that drew the FBI to Dr. King's
Martin's,
case,
yes.
that drew the FBI to the Black Panther Party, and I'm sure it drew the FBI toward what we were doing, but we were in such love in pursuit of justice, and we had the knowledge of history to help filter some of what was happening. So we continued to press through, and by God's grace, Oscar's family stepped in with us, and then we merged at the hip. These two got married out of the result.
Sure.
So we merged at the hip.
Yes,
pursued
and I
justice.
think something else that was going on was the fact that those videos that people took, the passengers on those trains, galvanized the nation, because they were they were shown more than 1 million times.
Yes.
And so I think everybody was kind of touched by what was going on and looking towards the trial that had happened, which was very dissatisfying for a lot of people.
Exactly.
So when did you get involved, actively involved?
I'd like to make a statement right before I talk about when did I get involved. When we talk about Mesley looking like he was shocked, right, and he was so disappointed, that's like taking a glass of water and trying to determine whether it's half full or half empty. That look of shock was the fact that Oscar didn't have a gun. Not that he had made a mistake, because he didn't feel he had made a mistake. He just perceived that Oscar had a weapon, and he drew his weapon and he shot. And then when he realized he didn't have a gun, that shock that the news media and many think that was about, oh, I'm so sorry for what I did, it was a mistake, was not that.
But you think there was genuine shock that Oscar didn't have a gun?
Right.
Well, no, had it been really, yeah, it was genuine shock, because there was no legal restraint for him to not apologize that night on the platform.
Can I
Day
say,
two, there was no legal restraint. So the point is that,
Well, that
yes,
would have been an admission of guilt.
well, no, there was no legal restraint.
May I say that the greatest shock here was the shock of Oscar Grant, not of Mesley. And even the subject matter as it arises tends to show sympathy for Mr. Mesley.
Right.
When the greatest sympathy should have been for Oscar Grant. And he's
Well,
the one who looked up
I
and
am
looked
sure
at
the
Mesley and
greatest-
said, "You shot me."
The
That's who was
greatest
shocked.
sympathy is, I think, for most thinking people, for Oscar Grant.
Yes.
Right.
However, when you're examining the evidence and people make statements, you try to say, okay, what's behind those statements? I mean, what is he conveying, and is what he's conveying in line with what he was really thinking?
He thought
And
he
how
had
do
a
you
gun.
get into somebody's head?
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's what the jurors think. No, did he really mean that? And so I'm asking it just in terms of looking at the evidence
Oh, I understand.
and how you explain
Don't
what's
bring the
going
fire
on.
back up. That was 10 years ago.
But if I can finish, what got me involved was the fact that I can remember watching the news, and I can see the outrage of people that was rebelling. And they weren't rebelling just because Oscar had been shot, but they were rebelling because the system, by design, had created the degradation that we see in our community. And so people responded to that.
Here is evidence of it.
Here's evidence of it. We've been saying this for years, and now we got it on camera. And so that video really enhanced the community to take what was in their DNA in the Bay Area. The fire point for activism just came out. There's no place that has the spirit of activism in it like the Bay Area, because we will activate about everything. You know what I'm saying? and so when I saw that, and then I saw the love of people consistently putting their lives on the line, losing their employment, going to jail, speaking really powerful to
because of all the protests that were in the streets.
Right, and I saw love in that, and it was because of that love of people embracing us, standing with us, crying with us, going back and forth to court with us, that really propelled me to feel that I can actually stand as a man and speak to this heinous act. And it was because of the community that propelled me to get involved.
So let's talk about what has come out of it. Where have we come? How far have we come?
If I can kind of lace things down. Of course, video became an essence of the policing agencies all throughout the country because of what happened with Oscar.
So you're saying police started wearing video cameras?
Oscar was the reason why that was propelled into the movement of agencies being required to wear. Because there was a time period in the early days when many of the states was actually passing legislation to bar you from filming the police.
And police could come by and take your camera.
Right.
Exactly, and so people were being arrested
and so
for that.
I'm thinking at the time this happened, didn't the authorities try to confiscate people's cell phones?
They did.
They did on the Fruitvale BART station
Not just
platform,
there. San Leandro,
train.
when they got off.
Right.
They said for evidence.
Right. They took many of people's cameras.
They coerced witnesses
Right.
to surrender their cameras. And it came out in testimony as one of the witnesses that had a camera lost it at San Leandro BART and cried in the witness stand because that person had never seen the video before. So they were capturing people coming through the stations.
Did people get their cell phones back?
I don't know what they do with that evidence after the case strikes, but you know, you're talking a year away, so who doesn't get a new phone in this
But it seems
time?
to me you can always make copies of the videos that people have, unless this was a way of shutting people up.
Absolutely.
This was a way of
That's
confiscating
exactly.
all of the evidence so people didn't have anything to
And
show.
most of our people don't know our rights, and cell phones are a newer technology. So what right do we know that we have with reference to law enforcement stops
Well, it's my cell
and their
phone.
handling of your cell phone? Now they've got laws about texting while driving, justifiably so, but does the officer have a right to demand your cell phone
And to
scroll
look at
through
it.
and see what was the
Exactly.
last time you
Exactly.
texted
Exactly.
or you on Facebook or Instagram while driving? Does the officer have that right? I actually don't know. I probably wouldn't give him that right if I were stopped. And I don't know the technicality of the law about their viewing
Well,
of the
if
face
you're
of a cell
in an
phone.
accident, it might be justifiable, not for the officer. But if you're charged with something, then it could be as evidence.
But legally, you have to give consent. That's called
true.
That's true. Search and seizure. You can't just search someone's cell phone to verify whether they actually used it or not. You know, and so we have a right to say no. They can't go in your pocket without your
Well,
consent.
you know, I'm thinking of the Patriot Act that came along. I don't know how much that changed, but that certainly was a threat to people's rights. You know, with the explosion of the World Trade Center and the actions that were taken later on.
Right.
And so this has gone through the
And a
courts.
whole new form of police investigating.
Yes,
occurred on
exactly,
this
and
case
search and
because
seizure and
the rallies that occurred that you spoke of.
Yes.
People were moving through the streets of Oakland that were communicating over Twitter and Facebook.
Right.
So Twitter and Facebook accounts became a focal point for OPD, for area police networks to see how they were moving these crowds around police barricades.
Yes, and that
through social
reminds me,
media.
I think it was not long after that BART was accused of shutting down people's
Oh,
cell
they
phones.
did.
Oh, they
For,
did.
for
Yeah.
that very cause.
Right.
Yes.
They didn't want activists
Right.
planning and executing plans.
Because I can remember
inside the
one
BART
of the BART
station in San Francisco.
spokespersons says that BART is our territory, our real estate, and we have a right to control what goes on
and
inside of it. And
and
that was challenged.
Right, and that reason, because you had asked, you don't know how many people actually been killed by BART police officers, but prior to Oscar, already 9 had been killed. And when that incident occurred with BART shutting down cell phones, it was because I think it was Charles Blair, if I remember right. It was a homeless white male who was killed in San Francisco by the BART Police Department. I believe it was at the Montgomery station, and people just exploded.
And
so-
they were sharing messages with each other, and then
Exactly.
that's when.
Yeah, my wife and I can tell you in Ferguson and how there was a call that people wanted to shut down one of the expensive malls in a nice suburban area, and we did. And then they went on their cell phones and talked about the next mall we was going to go to. They had the Army waiting for us.
That's right.
See what I'm saying? The Army was waiting for us, so that there was nowhere in the world we could go in there and shut down the mall.
So I wonder,
We went around it. We got to the next
how
mall.
do you think, was there an infiltrator, or were they tapping into the cell phones to find out
Exactly.
what was
That's
going on?
That's
All of the
exactly.
above.
Oh, yes.
All of the
All
above.
of the above.
All
As
of
we
the
were
above.
organizing weekly to demand justice for Oscar Grant, we had to, at a certain point, police the structure
Right.
and the personalities that were appearing.
Oh, yes.
So
Yeah, that's-
sometimes you'll find that all of a sudden people pop in and pop out. All of a sudden complaints will start being cast. I'm reminded of the disputes between W.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, where one accuses the other and the other accuses the one. That happens in these movements.
Right.
Folks wanted to know, why are Muslims talking so much? What about the Christian leadership? And that was the beauty of Reverend Humphreys,
Right.
because he and I and Minister Christopher and Reverend Langford and many others, Reverend Van Hook, Reverend Zach Carey, we did not allow for anyone to cast aspersion at us for coming from different denominations, different faith traditions, nor did we allow anyone to cast aspersions at the activists, who were mostly black, but there were white ones too. We actually created out of that town hall what we called the community council. So regardless of the city council's action, out of the town hall, we created a community council that was black, brown, red, yellow, and white.
That takes quite a lot of doing, because the first thing the opposition does is to divide people.
Absolutely.
And once you divide them, then you can strategically go in and begin to control what's going on.
Can I say something with that? So after the funeral and some of the rallies, so all of a sudden all these organization pops up. That's one thing that happens in these kind of things. And so I was going to all the meetings. Everybody was fighting in like these different organizations.
In terms of strategy?
Yes, no, they were
yes.
just fighting, not just for strategy, but because somebody wanted to be the leader or somebody. It was just a mess. So I came and told Minister Keith, I said, Mr. Keith, I've been going to these meetings. All these people is crazy. They're fighting. All of them are fighting. I said, we got to do something. We got to do something. He said, well, why don't we just bring them over across the street to the cafe, and then we'll have meetings. So I went back and he contacted some, I contacted some, and that's how those community council meetings started.
How do you, yes, because
they needed that. And Minister Keith's leadership and, really constructed that. He was there in the beginning, but he could just leave because it was so structured. He could come in and then leave and go across the street and take care of his
now
meeting
I have a
and then come
question
back.
for you.
And so that was the beauty of it.
How do you get people, for something as important as this, to get their egos out of the way?
Well, it requires love
Right.
of what you're doing. And when we are in love with the cause that we have engaged, then I remember Minister Farrakhan saying that when love is thick, faults are thin. So while I can point out faults if I want to, let's keep our focus on justice for Oscar Grant, and we were blessed to be able to hold together a coalition of hundreds of people until that case was settled. We even continued after the case was settled for a number of months
and since we're talking about it, before we go on to the legislation that came out of it and the legislation we're working on now, the way that case was settled, as far as Mesley was concerned, is that, but he eventually got something like 2 years?
Well, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. However, the judge worked it down to where he threw out the gun enhancement. He reduced his time. He gave him 2 days served for every day in jail, which reduced his time down to 11 months. That was all by design. And then he was placed in Men's LA County Jail.
And I think he walked away after 7 months.
Well, it was actually 11 months. And I had, you can join the VINE program that actually give victims of crime like myself, my sister, our family, the right to know his whereabouts, when he's going to go for a court hearing, his release date, and they're required by law, the state of California law, to notify the family, so that this way we're not impacted a second time, or he can't just be in our jurisdiction or within a certain radius of our life.
But he changed his name.
Correct.
So if someone like that changes his name, do you still get a notice of what the name is?
So in regards to that, my sister restitution from him stopped. Everything that we did know has disappeared, went dark. And so part of SB 1421 is the right to know, is that I can make a public records request, which I have, to find out whether he is working, or not just working, but to get internal information concerning him at BART, you know. And then that would actually, I'm hoping, go through the back door of the system to allow us to see who he is today.
So SB 1421? 1421?
Yes, it's
it has already passed?
Okay, so
or
yes, it has.
So I can give you
yes, it has.
Yeah, I'm gonna clear the so last year we championed SB 1421 as well as AB 748. Both of those bills were signed into law, of course, by Jerry Brown at the time, and then became effective January 1st, 2019.
So tell us about AB 74.
Okay, so AB 748 is the
748.
Yes,
AB 748.
It's by Senator Ten out of San Francisco, which is about the audio-video release. Part of the trauma that families experience is the idea of not knowing what happened to their loved one. And so many families for years make a request to see the video. If it was a lapel camera worn, can I see the video? And they are denied that. And most of the time they claim it's under investigation, but 2-3 years down the road, you still haven't seen the video, you're suffering that much. And so the many years you're denied information about what happened to your loved one really put you in a state of total depression.
So let me just say, to comment on that, what happened in Chicago, you know, with the young man who had been shot 16 times.
Laquan McDonald's.
Yes, exactly. And the family didn't know what had happened until a reporter, maybe 2 years later, acting for the press's right to know, happened to have seen the video and made it public. And that's when this whole case came to light.
Exactly.
And that police officer now was sentenced to prison. I forget what his sentence was, charged with murder.
Before we came in, Uncle Bobby and I were talking about these bills and how they are designed to shine light on what have happened. Jesus said, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." And the problem that the people have is that when law enforcement is involved in murder or homicide, whether it was justifiable or unjustified, the mechanisms in place have been to cover, protect the shield of blue, rather than to render justice. I'll never forget meeting with the late Mayor Ron Dellums over another videotape shooting of a young man named Brownie Polk in a liquor store in East Oakland. And when we met with Mr. Mayor, we knew that there was a tape because it was inside of a store.
Right.
And he was milling through in his mind and heart, what do we do with this tape? And even though they would eventually say to the family that it was a justifiable homicide, the tape went under the table. And it took the family to get attorneys more than a year to actually see that videotape. So what happened with Laquan McDonald? In Oscar's case, the videotape was released by a passenger whose phone was not captured by the BART police.
Now, I have a question. That's evidence. But what stops the police and those authorities from tampering with the evidence,
They're
or even
protecting their assets.
or destroying the evidence?
They have,
because
right?
if the
They've
tape
done
went
that.
under the
Right.
table,
They've
they
done
could
that,
very well say
and
it
that's the
didn't
value.
exist.
That's the value of the legislation that Uncle Bobby and others are working toward, so that the way that kind of evidence is handled, as we have always known, that when our people have been unjustifiably killed by police, there's no explanation, there's no evidence. If they're investigating, they say it takes years to figure out what this is. This just happened with Mario Woods. And we met with the district attorney on multiple occasions, and he milled through whether or not the law as it is written would support the pursuit of charges. He would give us the ethics of being a district attorney.
But
and
at the
how, if I don't see it in the law, I can't bring a charge. If it's a case that I don't think I can win, this is the DA in San Francisco talking, because while there was videotape evidence of Mario Woods
Standing there with a knife, shot by what, 5 police officers?
something
How
like
many
that.
times?
Something like that.
And that's
But the reality is, if that video wasn't released by people, we would not have seen it.
Right.
So it's passengers, it's pedestrians, it's citizens with cameras that make it known.
And I should say there is a case in South Carolina. I don't know if you
Walter
remember
Scott.
that. Yes, where
Walter
the
Scott.
person was shot while he was running away, and the
Exactly.
police officer put the gun beside him.
Right.
But
Well, actually,
walking,
taser beside him.
someone walking by happened to have stood there behind the fence and taped everything going on.
Can I say this? I just want to say that that's why 392
392.
is so important, because even with all those bills, if the police are not held accountable, because we have Shalene Tyndall, who was murdered by a BART police officer on January 3rd, 2018. His hands were up and he was shot in the back, and that video is out. They are not charging those officers. And there's video. And there's video to show the man had his hands up. And
But they feared for their lives.
okay, that's
That's
why.
what
That he,
claim.
that he might have turned around very quickly and
Right.
was holding
392,
something
that's
in
why
his
it's so
hands.
important, because we have these bills, we got
And
film,
could
we
you
have
say
all that.
something? And we had
Yes.
hoped to have Dr. Shirley Weber from San Diego talk about 392, but AB 392, which she calls Saving Our Lives.
That's correct.
Do you know anything more about that bill?
Oh, of course.
I'm very versed on that bill. The idea behind the bill is actually to be able to hold or criminally charge officers for using excessive force. So right now the standard, according to the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, is that what is it that a reasonable officer would do in a situation like this? Well, we're taking that word reasonable and changing it to necessary. And then there is a idea of de-escalation tactics. So instead of just looking and thinking what a reasonable officer would do, the whole totality of the situation will warrant whether the officer utilized de-escalation tactics. For example, right, Tamir Rice, within 2 seconds as the officer pulls up, he shoots and kills. But had the officer stopped, which he could have stopped, he could have used a bullhorn, or he could have said to this young man that he didn't know was a child, show your hands. It's understood that you have a gun. No form of de-escalation tactics was used.
And also there was the young man walking with this play rifle. Where
That's
was
Andy
that?
Lopez
Was
in
that
Santa Rosa.
Okay, yeah, he had gotten it from a friend.
Walking
He's
down the
walking
street.
home. He was already warned now. You got to be careful walking with that. And
Mm-hmm.
he's walking, and this police drives by with this trainee and immediately shoots him.
Right. So the question becomes, who was he warned by? See,
Oh, this was another friend.
Right,
or
right,
his
exactly.
mother or somebody saying, no, you got to be careful
because,
with that.
And the reason why
Because
he
it
was
looks so-
warned that way was
so
because
real.
of the climate. See, there were people of brown and black skin being killed on a regular and consistent basis. So his friends or family mentioned even having a toy outside your house is extremely dangerous. And so therefore, be careful. And before Andy could turn around, the officer fires and kills him.
I know, and when you talk about having a bullhorn or something, I mean, don't you kind of warn people? I mean, don't you investigate first before you? It's like shoot first and ask questions later.
A white gentleman in a white suburban neighborhood can have a rifle in his hand, threaten to kill people. The police is called. They will talk him down. The preservation of life is at the utmost in these suburban neighborhoods with white threatening or crisis moment type people in a mental state. But if it was a black person in a black neighborhood walking down the street with a gun that was off his meds, when the police rolls up, immediately shots are going to be fired because the gentleman might turn and they automatically...
Well, the person doesn't have to be walking down the street. You remember the story of the man in the Walmart store who had just purchased the gun.
That's John Crawford.
And he's walking in the store to buy it, and the police pull up and shoot him. I mean, they come into the store and immediately...
What this demonstrates is that this is not really about training. Because you can't untrain a racist mind that fears black and non-white skin. That's a racist mind. So that mind has to really be uprooted in the hiring process, so that those that are trained properly under what conditions that a escalation of force should occur. But if you got one that sees Tamir Rice was not just young, what was he, 13? He looked young.
Oh, yes, but you know what, they
young.
Already had indicated that police officer should not have been hired. They had already admitted that he had emotional problems and had been fired from...
Well, because the shoot was so ugly, they had to offer a justification. But the reality is, whoever that officer was, there are thousands of others around the country being hired under the same standard, being sent through the same post-training, yet they're making their way into these law enforcement agencies.
But you know what, that training is obviously inadequate. And I would think while you have to uproot the mind, you still have to deal with the officers who are on the force. And there is, I think there is no excuse for not supplying better training for those who were there. Well, and getting rid of those who are not following the training.
Well, I guess the question is, how do you untrain hatred? How do you untrain fear of that which needs not to be feared?
You have to have psychological testing, and you put people through psychological testing, and if they don't come out in some reasonable manner, well, then you let them go.
But
so
yes,
you have the police union.
I hope it doesn't work under the standard of these college tests, where rich people have gone in and spent tens of thousands of dollars to pass a test. So as long as that's not involved in the test, so you would really need those that have a real understanding of the mind of racism, white supremacy, and hatred to craft a test.
You're absolutely
and
right.
one who's an expert in fear.
You're absolutely
to
right.
craft a test that makes some kind of sense.
You have to have people who are
it makes
really...
no sense that the primary victim of these murders are black people. So you have to put in the issue of race in what's in the mind of the shooting officers, and that's whether the officers are black or white.
And you have to have, before you do that, and remember your point, I just want to say, before you have what you're talking about, you have to have a sincere determination by people in charge or in control that they really want to deal with the problem correctly.
And that's why I was going to add this, because historically, there are going to be many that don't even know that they are, and there's many that do know that they are. So that's a reality. But the only thing that will fix that is accountability. We need a criminal justice system that will take a police officer, right, that have committed a wrong, caught on video, caught in the report that he falsified, right, and his history shows that he's been involved in complaints filed against him for brutality and excessive use of force, and put him in jail.
And you need something else too.
Yeah.
In terms of that blue code or that blue
Well,
line,
that's my point.
That's
So
why
if I
you
could
busted out.
finish,
and the police union.
if I could finish, what that will do will not only put the individual in jail, but his accomplice, the one that stood with him that failed to report truthfully what that officer did that was wrong prior to even the shooting, because it might have been discussed. And when the one that actually pulled the trigger goes to prison, and the one that tried to hide what the pulled trigger one did goes to prison, then I will, as a police officer, tell on you for pulling a bad act.
If you're going to be penalized.
That's
Right.
for
accountability.
Yes.
Just let me say, if
Accountability.
accountability was the law, that I think the blue lines that they're talking about, because that'll relieve some police chief and some police officers who really want to tell, but they're not willing to cross that line. This law will relieve them from answering to anybody, the police union or anybody, because it's a law that if this officer does this, it is out of the police chief's hands.
And you're saying
Yeah.
this is AB 392?
Yes.
Okay, so are there any other bills that are pending that have been passed that you know about, that we should know about?
Right. Well, we talked a little bit about SB 1421, and just so that we know, Senator Nancy Skinner championed SB 1421, which was also signed into law on January 1st.
And Senator Nancy Kennedy
Nancy Skinner.
Skinner, I'm
Out
sorry.
of Berkeley.
Okay, Berkeley.
Right.
Okay.
She championed or co-authored this bill, and Dr. Weber was also a co-author on the bill, and a few others. I think Holly Mitchell out of L.A. But anyhow, that bill says that the public, you as a media person, has the right to know what kind of officers are working for East Palo Alto Policing Agency. And these officers that are possibly falsified reports, involved in sexual crimes, or involved in a
But
shooting.
you know what they say, that these are personnel matters.
No, no longer. It
No
used to
longer.
Crime should never be a person.
Right.
Right. It used to be.
And when BART refused to fire Meserly,
Right.
we went to the BART board and raised that exact point.
No, he
That
resigned,
murder,
didn't he,
they
7
didn't
days
fire
later?
him.
Right. He
Right.
resigned.
They
He
did not
resigned.
fire him. I questioned the then BART chief, who quit shortly thereafter, and I asked him, did you question Meserly about what he's done? He said, no. I said,
But why?
yeah, in essence, why? And could you compel him to answer a question? He said, yes. I said, well, if he doesn't answer the question, what can you do? We can charge him with insubordination and, in essence, fire him. They
Why
didn't
didn't you do
fire
it?
him.
But then at the
they
same-
circled the wagons
but then
around him,
wouldn't they
and
have
the
said-
police chief led a fundraiser among the union to raise money to bail Meserly out. That was, I forget, Chief G.
Right.
He put his signature on an effort made to raise money for Meserly's bail. So he wasn't in pursuit of justice.
Right.
He was in pursuit of protecting Meserly and the reputation of the police.
That's right.
Now, the first things that came out at that time was the DA quit because he didn't want to take the case to trial. The police chief of BART quit because he had to quit.
Right.
The BART general manager
Dorothy,
quit
Dorothy.
She had to
because they
go.
couldn't take the pressure.
Right.
And then the state of California passed a legislation to permit the construction or the development of a police review board at BART itself. And they filtered it down before it got to the
Noted.
final vote, but it is in practice now.
So in the few minutes that we have left, and it's just a few minutes, what would you like to share that we haven't discussed that you may want the viewing audience to know?
Well, definitely, I would like the viewing audience to take a look at AB 392, which is Saving Our Lives legislation that Dr. Shirley Weber, Assemblywoman Dr. Shirley Weber out of San Diego, has co-authored with Holly Mitchell, Senator Holly Mitchell, and Senator Bradford out of Sacramento. Holly Mitchell is out of LA. AB 392 is common sense legislation about saving lives.
And what can people do?
Well, on the ACLU website, you can go there and actually log in to see who is your representative and inform that representative that you would like this bill to be supported by your local, your in-district representative. You can watch for the request that people come to the state capitol for lobby day to speak to their representative in regards to working to pass AB 392. It's going to take a mass movement from the state of California in order to get 392 passed, because the police unions, the most strongest lobbyist group in the nation, has bought many of our representatives to have them fear the idea of any legislation that holds officers accountable for the wrongs that they commit.
I would like to say that law came in because of the loss of life of Stephan Clark. That's how that Dr. Weber was through. It was the tip and iceberg for her. And so
he was shot in his grandmother's backyard.
Yes. And this is
with his back to the police, right?
Yes, and this is the weekend of that happening. So my last thing that I would say is that people join the family in their fight. Join the fight of the family in the Stephan Clark Legacy Weekend that's coming this weekend.
A Stephan Clark Legacy Weekend
yes,
this weekend.
Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday.
And this is the weekend of, this will be shown starting to air this weekend.
Right.
So
anyway.
anyway.
They can catch it Monday, because there's going to be something on Monday. So it's from Friday to Monday. So this bill was spun out of his death.
Right.
Minister Muhammad.
Minister Farrakhan teaches us how to protect democracy. And in his lessons to us, he shares that the elected leaders are not leaders, they're servants. So the organizing efforts that Uncle Bobby and others are making are to make demands on those in politics that they would actually serve what's in the best interest of the people. If that does not work, we don't have a real democracy, we're in something else. And so as an opportunity, we must organize ourselves to make stronger demands for justice for our people.
I think preceding that, we have to make people care, don't you think?
Absolutely.
Because if they care enough, then they will take the type of actions that you're talking
Which
about.
is why when Oscar was murdered, when Trayvon was murdered, when Mike Brown was murdered, you heard a universal cry that began with Oscar Grant.
That's right.
And that was, I am Oscar Grant. I had at that time a 15-year-old son who was on his way toward college. He never rode BART until he left to go to college, which was a few months after the murder of Oscar Grant. I took him to the Fruitvale BART station weekly or daily almost to drop him off and pick him up, and it's horrific to any parent to wonder whether or not my son is going to come out of this BART station. So
or to
Oscar
come back
Grant.
home.
Right.
Generally, from any place.
Absolutely.
Right.
I'd like to thank you. This is, you have given very, very strong messages. And we need to know the legislation and the things that we can do. So thanks so much again. I'd like to thank our viewers for watching. Until next time.